Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us here. We're going to talk today for about maybe 25 minutes or so on it's a niche topic. It's a pretty narrow topic, but it's one that I think can be very helpful in terms of increasing your job profitability and also achieving some non-quantifiable goals that we have on a lot of our government contracts. So the topic is the Indian Incentive Program, which is actually over the course of different regulations, actually a lot broader than that, but we'll cover it under the penumbra of just that one act. And so the people that will benefit from this are going to be all of our project and program managers and division directors and anybody who's concerned with P&L on their project, but also contract administrators and estimators, people who are involved in the selection and vetting and ultimate choice of the subcontractors that we choose. And then ultimately, really, this is of value to anybody who's, in the ESOP program, right? Because what this basically is a government program that drops money to our bottom line. And that money obviously benefits all of us. So in addition to those dollar benefits, we'll also talk a little bit about who else benefits. And some of that's going to be the companies that are actually chosen, who are eligible for the program, as well as us in terms of our CPARs, as well as future proposals. When we write up things like our small business support and our results, these are the types of things that will help improve those write-ups. All right, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to show you just a little 3-minute video that's not mine. This is from the DoD. And then kind of my remaining 15 to 20 minutes will kind of give a little bit more depth and detail on everything that is here in the DoD video. So let me start with this, and then I'll pick up talking when this is done.
Native Americans have a long history of patriotically contributing to the U.S. military. Today, Native American, Alaskan, and Hawaiian Native-owned small businesses in the fields of engineering, construction, and IT continue to supply the Department of Defense with dependable, high-quality supplies and services. Despite recent upward trends in economic activity due in part to these small businesses, Native American reservations, Alaska, and Hawaiian Native villages still suffer some of the worst poverty in the country. In an effort to boost economic development, Congress has encouraged federal contracting agencies to use more Native American-owned subcontractors, organizations, and businesses. The Department of Defense's Indian Incentive Program, or IIP, is a great example of this encouragement being put to work. IIP is administered by the DoD Office of Small Business Programs and motivates government contractors to use their best efforts to give Native American-owned businesses the greatest opportunity to participate in subcontracts. IIP incentivizes prime contractors by providing them with a 5% rebate on subcontracted work performed by Native American businesses. Eligible prime contractors must first identify a Native American, Alaskan, Hawaiian-owned firm as a subcontractor or supplier in accordance with the appropriate contract clause, while subcontracting firms must submit proof of tribal, Native Alaskan, Hawaiian affiliation to the prime contractor. Prime contractors must then submit requests for Indian incentive payments to DoD contracting officers who review and verify all documents. Finally, DoD contracting officers submit rebate request packages to OSD/OSBP for review and approval. If you're interested in participating or learning more about IIP, visit our website. Here you can find out in detail who is eligible to participate, what the contract requirements are, how you can prepare an IIP request, where you can submit the request, and when you can and can't submit a request. DoD is committed to the partnership and development of Native American-owned small businesses. This relationship leads to economic success and provides added value to the federal government.
Okay.
Check out this verbo.
Oh, man. Michael, they're your cousins.
Look,
There we go. Okay. So kind of like the video teased, you can contact them for the who, what, when, where, and why of the program, but that's really what we're going to cover in our remaining time. So I will save you having to contact the DoD department, and we'll go through that information now. So the basis of the law is just this. It's kind of what they said. For every dollar that we subcontract to an eligible company, and we'll go through what constitutes an eligible company, we then become eligible ourselves to get 5% back from the government. So it's important to kind of to understand, and I'll maybe mention this more than once, so that our clients understand this doesn't come out of their budget. So it's not a matter of them being able to go get funding. This is a special pool that Congress allots every year. It's about $25 million a year, and every year it gets tapped out. But that Congress, the pool that Congress has set aside is where the money comes from. Right? We do have to request it through our contracting officers, and so sometimes that takes a little bit of education if they haven't, encountered it or walked through this process before. But we've been pretty successful in kind of being able to explain the rules of the road to them and then have them forward those applications up to the right locations. Years ago, this was kind of a really well-kept secret, and we used to apply for a lot of these, and we would get them paid really rapidly. And then at some point in time, kind of the secret got out. The pool used to not even be capped, it was capped, but it was never fully tapped. And now the pool has increased over the course of years, and it is tapped every year. It capped out. So in some cases, we may submit, and we may not even get paid for 2 or 3 years, but it's still free money whenever it hits. All right, so who's eligible, even though it's called the Indian Incentive Program, which is sometimes you'll hear me refer to it as Indian Incentive Act. That was the original legislation. Since then, it's been broadened to include not only Indian-owned firms, but also Alaska Native corporations and Native Hawaiian corporations. And we'll talk about what those are in a subsequent slide. Now, it has to be on a contract that includes the right clause. So I have those two clauses listed there. But basically what this means is it's going to be on most of our work, DoD work. Where we haven't seen it is sometimes on our projects that are overseas. And intuitively, that might make a little sense that if you're doing a job in Italy, you're potentially not going to find a lot of Native Hawaiian or Native Alaskan companies that are going to support that. I mean, we have in the past, but for those reasons, a lot of times we don't see the clause on our international work. The other area that you won't see it, of course, would be on state work. It's not going to be a flow down through the FEMA clauses on fires work or anything of that nature. But most all of our government contracts domestically should have the clause. Okay, so who qualifies? And I'll go into these in a little bit more detail, but basically it's your 3 primary subgroups, right? Native Americans, and that's going to be a subcontractor supplier that's owned by a federally recognized tribe or member of a recognized tribe, and we'll talk about kind of what that is. There are such things as Native Americans that are not recognized, so it has to be one of the federally recognized groups. And then the ownership has to be proper, right? So you can't have a group that's owned 99% by, whomever, and then they bring in a Native American as the 1% owner, and somehow that would qualify them. Generally, it's going to be a more than majority ownership and day-to-day management, right? So you can't bring in figureheads. It has to be actually the group to whom the program is intended to benefit is who will get the benefit. Same thing applies for Native Alaskans, and same thing there. There are federally recognized groups, so it's not just anybody from Alaska. It's going to be subcontractor or supplier owned by a native village or native group. We'll talk about what those are, including the recognized corporations as defined by the Native Claims Settlement Act. So again, you might have somebody who owns a business that's headquartered in Alaska. They may or may not be eligible, depending on, really, it's the other factors. And then the same thing for Native Hawaiian, except Native Hawaiian is really probably the most stark in terms of the contrast. So the owner of the Native Hawaiian subcontractor would have to be recognized as Native Hawaiian. And in my experience, the criteria there tend to be a lot sharper than for the other 2 groups. So the impact there is that there are relatively few Native Hawaiian groups compared to, the overall population of Hawaii. So for Native Alaska corporations, just so we kind of know, what does that mean? I mean, is this like a handful of corporations? And the short answer is no. It's a very, very large enterprise. And a lot of this goes back to politics in the 60s and 70s, and I won't get into it. But basically, it means that there are 12 designated corporations that employ probably at this point in time, over about 60,000 people. And it doesn't necessarily have to have a whole lot or anything to do with Alaska. We have seen Native Alaskan corporations that are, headquartered in Alabama, that are headquartered in other states. So, they've got their ties to Alaska, but that doesn't mean necessarily that all of their people are located there or that their footprint is there. They do work all over the country and really all over the world. The other benefit that ANCs get, which doesn't directly impact us, but ANCs can then also own a subset of 8A corporations, which allows them to get sole source work directly from the government. Okay, this is a little bit of history. I won't go into it in too much detail, but you can kind of just see the growth of the 8A ANC program and see that it really got enormous at one point in time. And then they've enacted some new laws that kind of limited the amount of sole source they could get in terms of the dollar value. So the program has kind of fallen back to earth a little bit in the 20-aughts and later, just due to some of the regulatory changes. Okay, so for those enterprises, like I said, it's got to have ownership and management, not a figurehead, but it has to be managed by the designated person who falls into the right category. For Indian owner enterprises, like I mentioned, that will be a tribe that's certified by the Secretary of Interior. So it doesn't happen often, but it has happened a few times that we'll have somebody come and say, "Oh, we're an Indian-owned company," and then when we ask them for the documents that prove that, it turns out that they claim some heritage, which may be factually accurate, but it's not recognized by the Secretary of Interior. I don't exactly know all the history of that, but some tribe that for whatever purposes is recognized as something else, and so they're not eligible. So it's not a self-certification where you just check the box and say I'm Indian, I'm 1/8 this or I'm whatever. You have to be certified by the Secretary of the Interior. Okay, for NHOs, it's the same thing. It's 51% or more owned by the Native Hawaiian, and like I said, this one is a little bit more complicated. That person has to be a descendant of Aboriginal people who exercise sovereignty on the island, and there is a state agency that looks at actual birth records, the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, who will actually tell you whether or not you are or are not technically Native Hawaiian. So it sounds like a detailed review of genealogical records and your ancestry to qualify. For that reason, there are NHOs. I mean, they do exist, but there's not tens of thousands of NHOs. Okay, so if you have questions when we're looking at subcontractors to find out if they qualify, there are websites that we can go to. Also, just within the confines of sam.gov and the old SBA site, we can also normally look and find out whether somebody is legitimate or whether they may have some problems with their paperwork. But you definitely want to know that going in. You don't want to think, hey, I'm choosing these people because they're Native Hawaiian and they're going to qualify me for a program, to only later find out that they're actually just a, run-of-the-mill large business and they're not going to qualify. Okay, so how many people participate in the program? Prime contractors, a little bit over 100 different contractors are in, and a little bit over 160 different organizations. If you look at the dollar value, kind of like I mentioned, this is an old slide, but it goes all the way back into the 90s when this used to be a really small program. But even when it was only $4 or $8 million, we used to get the money that we requested pretty promptly because nobody really knew about it. Then it went from the smaller numbers to 8 to 15 and now to 25. And now, because it is so well known, we do tend to end up waiting a number of years to get the request processed. So as you see from, where they weren't actually tapping out all the dollars here in the early aughts, from fiscal year 15 onward, it's been 100% of the money that's allotted every year. Okay, so why is it important? Like I mentioned, we talk about it from the financial aspect, but also it is an important marketing tool. I mean, it will help our, by definition, anybody who's going to qualify as an Indian-owned or a Native Hawaiian or ANC will also be qualifying us for small business, as well as small minority business. And in some cases, it might even be women-owned or vet-owned or Hubs-owned, but that's just all gravy at that point. But it will definitely increase our small business numbers. So it's a good tool from that perspective. Also, just simply participating in the program is the kind of thing, like I mentioned, that can go into proposals, and it really makes your program look a lot more robust, that you're actually seeking out these companies. Like they mentioned in the video, some of these areas are just the absolute poorest areas in the country. And so to the extent that we can put money into the companies that are located there, that's a good story to be able to tell, whether it's for award nominations, small business CPAR qualitative write-ups, or just our general CPAR small business evaluation. Okay. And like I mentioned in this last clause, in recent years, the demand far exceeds the funding, so you might wait a few years. The other thing that's important there too, is we'll talk about, is just making sure that your package is completely perfect when it goes in, because if you submit a package that's missing information, you could get kicked out of the queue, and it could be an extra 2 years before you see your money. So how do you qualify? For us to qualify for that 5% rebate, we've got to have the right FAR clause in the contract. And so there have been a couple of times, I don't think it's super often, but if for some reason the clause isn't in the contract, normally you can contact the contracting officer and ask them to include it. There's only once that I can think of that we asked them to include it and they didn't. And kind of like I mentioned, it was an overseas project and they just felt like, it wasn't necessary. We actually were using an Indian-owned firm over there, so it would have been to our benefit, but the client didn't cooperate. For most of our U.S. projects, you'll see it, I think, already in there. Okay, so like I just mentioned, if you don't see it in your contract, contact your contracting officer and have them take care of that for you. Okay, so when should you receive it, or when should you request it, and then when should you receive it? So you can submit your request, at any time after you've paid the sub, but prior to their, even prior to their final invoice. Historically, what we've done is we just kind of wait till all their work is done. But again, if you've got a subcontractor with a really, really large scope of work, and we know it's going to take a few years to do it, we could submit these requests annually. So you could submit them, after the close of the year, December 31st, or, you can submit them at any time, as long as the work's been done and you've paid them for the work that has been done, right? So our results here have been kind of mixed. They've roller coastered over the years. But I think the largest incentive we ever received, I remember getting one that was close to $170,000. And again, that's, big money. So that just drops right to the bottom line of that project. And that was, it was a cost type job that we did up in Alaska. And so that, ended up really, really boosting the P&L for that project, as well as all the other, non-dollar benefits that go along with it. So if you have questions about, once you've selected somebody who handles the request, that goes to the contracts group. There's a little checklist that the government puts out. And I think we've got an internal checklist as well to kind of handle those requests. Basically, what you're going to be looking for is the subcontract, their invoices, proof that you've got the clause, evidence of the checks or the wire transfer, the ACH, just proof that they've been paid, proof of the company's eligibility. So their letter from Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, and as well as their own reps and certs, where they're certifying that they're eligible, cover letter and the request, and then hopefully within a year or 2 years, our client will contact us and tell us we have a modification coming. What normally happens then is the contracting officer will give us a mod on that contract, and it'll say, here's your, $23,000 or $48,000 or whatever you're going to get, and then we just invoice against that, and there's no costs. So that money just gets paid. Like I said, it kind of drops to the bottom line. So this presentation will go out to everyone after the fact. All of these links here are hyperlinks. So if you want more information, the YouTube that we watched or the IIP defense documents, you'll be able to hyperlink and get those. In the meantime, I would say, for success, really the way to do this is it doesn't happen organically. The purpose of this program isn't to, at the end of the year say, oh, yeah, I remember this, there's a program. Maybe I should look and see whether I accidentally gave any work to ANCs or Native Hawaiians. The way to be successful with the Indian Incentive Program is to plan for it. And that is to talk to your contracts group, talk to your estimators and say, look, when I'm bidding this job, I want to identify eligible vendors up front. That's the way to succeed. It's really the only way to succeed. Other than that, it's happenstance and it's luck. And I will tell you, the contractors that do good work in this area are easy to find if you go look for them, but they're not tens of thousands of companies that you're just statistically accidentally going to give work to and then find out later that they're eligible. So plan ahead for it. Think through, what are the companies out there? What can they do? Where are they located? How can they fit the job that I'm bidding on? or that I've already been awarded that I have yet to award subcontracts on, and then build them into the process. That's kind of the key to success. So, all right, so that's my 20 minutes. That's kind of about what I promised. I'll leave a few minutes open for questions, which I think I saw one, which I will go take a quick look at. Oh, there's way more than one.
There's
Okay.
about 4 in the chat. Yep.
Okay. So let's start with this one, the $25 million cap and its regular tap. Does it mean we eventually get the 5% that we submit, or that we could submit and not get it? So, or get a lesser percentage. So Craig, no chance we would get a lesser percentage because the law doesn't really allow for that. There's a chance that we'll get it eventually, or there is a chance we could never get it insofar as this. Once we've closed our contract out, then the request kind of becomes impossible to fulfill. So if you have a contract that for some reason the contracting officer absolutely wants you to do closeout, and to close it out, it's really old, then we have to make a business decision if there's a request pending with Indian Affairs, right? So, you know, if it's whatever, you know, pick a number. If it's a small enough number that we say, fine, we'll close out the contract and we'll let this request go, then so be it. Otherwise, I think we would just communicate to the contracting officer, hey, we can't close it out yet because we're still waiting on this thing. That said, I mean, if you look at the website, it says requests are taking more than 12 months. I think it might be more than 36 months at this point, but they do, you know, they do continue to drop in from time to time. So it's really just a matter of the sooner you get them in the queue, the more likely they're going to get paid. Does Canada have a similar program? Not to my knowledge, but that doesn't mean no, it just means not to my knowledge. Does the program also include companies from other U.S. territories such as Guam? So short answer there is no. But again, some of those companies, I mean, Guamanian companies won't qualify necessarily, but some could, just based on if there's a, you know, draw the Venn diagram. Do they fall into any of these other categories? So that may be one way to take a look at it. Olivia, do we have a way to identify Indian-owned subs in our database? Yes, there's a search criteria in the online PO system where you can search specifically just by that. That's kind of how we track progress to see what's been awarded in the past year. So you just check the box in the advanced search tool that will allow you to see which companies we've actually worked with. That said, it's not a big group, right? So it might be 10 different companies in the last few years. That data might not be super helpful. The more important data would not be which companies have we used, but the more important data would be which companies are out there that we should be using. So Paul Hunt, this isn't a question, but just a comment. We have submitted an application to SBA to form an 8A protege joint venture with a NHO. An NHO, Native Hawaiian organization. So if you have questions about that, or Paul, if you wanna stump it, now's your opportunity.
Yeah, sure. So we submitted that application back, I think November, December. We're expecting to hear back from the Small Business Administration here by the end of March. So we're hopeful that will go through. And they're a decent sized firm. They're part of the Kina Ole Foundation. They're called HGS, which is Honolulu Lima Government Solutions, LLC. And they provide a lot of IT services, long-term monitoring, O&M type services on environmental contracts, and a lot of compliance and EQ services. But they're looking to do anything that ECC wants to do, whether it's construction, environmental remediation, and they're looking to grow. So they'll hire people as needed. So if you have a job somewhere and they have a strong contingency out of Denver, San Antonio, and in Guam. That's about it. So contact me if you have any thoughts, and I'll definitely put out a notification on EchoNet once we get approved by SBA.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul. Okay, and our last question from Martin, it says, when you say work, are you referring to self-performance by the company, or does it include services like management, quality control rep, superintendents? So the short answer there, Martin, and everybody, is really anything that we have a purchase order for. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be work. It could also be supplies, right? So if we just bought 1,000 widgets from a qualified company, that would also make us eligible for the rebate. Or it could be, you know, like what you consider here, QC reps or superintendents, a body shop. If we are getting temporary labor from a company, or they're just providing, you know, an isolated service. Obviously, the more dollars, that we award to them is that is directly correlated to the amount of our rebate. So, $1 million construction project is going to put $50,000 to our bottom line, whereas, if we give somebody a $20,000 purchase order for limited services, that's a much smaller number. But that said, even if it was a small number, we still apply for it. Even if ultimately the amount of the rebate is $500, it pays for the paperwork to submit it, but it has these other non-tangible or non-monetary benefits. So we would always want to submit the request anyway. And we would definitely want to use these types of companies whenever we have the opportunity, because they do have these other tertiary benefits with regards to our small business plans. So that's all the questions in the chat. Barring anything else, I think we're right on time. And so I'll let everybody get about their day, and good turnout. So thanks everybody for being here.